Hello, everyone. So, as of late, there's been a lot of discussion surrounding this question: what is a woman? Uh, the question, what is a woman, is generally posed to people on the left by people on the right as a sort of rhetorical battering ram. On conservatives' view, this question is effective because the left has no coherent answer to it. The left, so the claim goes, in their attempts to be inclusive to trans people, have reduced the concept of woman to a sort of vacuous, incoherent mess. In this video, I'll try to elucidate and defend the left-wing view regarding the concept of woman. I will argue that there's nothing strange or confusing about how the left views this concept, and I'll argue that we have good reason to accept such a view. Of course, everything said here applies equally to the concept of man, but the question, what is a man, has seemingly caught on more, the question, what is a woman, has seemingly caught on more than the question, what is a man, for some reason, and I'm a slave to social trends, so that'll be the framework for this video. So I want to start by way of analogy between the concept of a parent and the concept of a woman. We have two understandings of the word parent. We have a biological understanding of the term parent, and we have a social understanding of the term parent. When we use the term parent in the first sense, we're referring to biological facts about the child's relation to the parent. When we use the term parent in the second sense, we're referring to a social relationship between the parent and the child. Some parents, like adoptive parents, are parents in the social sense, even though they aren't parents in the biological sense. So we have these two understandings of the term parent, which usually coincide, but sometimes they come apart, such as in the case of adoptive parents. In some contexts, when we use the term parent, we are referring to the biological sense. In some contexts, when we use the term parent, we are referring to the social sense. For example, when a doctor says, the test results came back, you're the child's parent, we take this to explicitly refer to the biological understanding of the term parent. However, when a teacher says, send a report card to the child's parent, we take this to refer to the social sense of the term parent. Those on the left view the concept of woman in a roughly analogous way. On this view, woman has a biological understanding, and woman has a social understanding. When we use the term woman in the first sense, the understanding of the term woman refers to biological sex characteristics. When we use the term woman in the second sense, the understanding of the term woman refers to one's social expressions and identification. Some women, i.e. trans women, are women in the social sense even though they can't be women in the biological sense, or even though they aren't women in the biological sense. So we have these two understandings of the term woman, which usually coincide, but sometimes they come apart, such as in the case of trans women. In some contexts, like medical contexts, when we use the word woman, we are referring to the biological sense. In some contexts, when we use the word woman, we are referring to the social sense. We can take the analogy between trans people and adoptive parents further. An adoptive parent is oftentimes someone who desperately wants to be a parent, but can't be one in the normal biological sense. So society has found a way for them to live the role of a parent and to be recognized socially and legally as a parent despite that. A trans woman is somebody who desperately wants to be a woman, but who can't be one in the typical biological sense. This is just what it means for your gender identity and your sex to not coincide. And so trans activists and people on the left are saying that we should find a way for these people to be able to live the role of a woman and be socially and legally recognized as a woman, despite the biological facts. So part of my point in bringing up this analogy is to help people start to comprehend on a simple level how the left is understanding the concepts of woman and man. But another important takeaway is this. The way in which the left is conceptualizing the category of woman is the exact same way in which society in general already conceptualizes other categories like parent. It's almost the exact same logic being applied. So the way that the left is understanding the concept of woman is not particularly confusing or paradoxical or unheard of. This way of understanding the concept of woman and man is perfectly clear and coherent. So really, when conservatives act like the left is doing some radical, confusing thing, it just seems like they're feigning ignorance and pretending to not understand logic that they understand perfectly well already and are willing to apply in other cases, because, let's be honest here, the logic in question is not particularly hard to grasp. Let's use this analogy to explore some more common conservative confusions surrounding trans issues. Nobody who's sane would say that an adoptive parent is delusional or ignoring the science when they say, "I'm my kid's parent." To react this way would be cruel, but perhaps more importantly, it would be stupid. It's stupid because if one were to say this, they'd just be equivocating on the word parent. When an adoptive parent uses the word parent, they're using the word to refer to the social sense of the word parent. If you were to respond that they're delusional for thinking that they're a parent because, in fact, they are not the kid's biological parent, then you're just misunderstanding, intentionally or unintentionally, what they mean when they say that they're a parent. When they say, "I'm a parent," they didn't intend to say that they are a biological parent. And so you aren't, so you pointing out that they aren't a biological parent doesn't prove that they've said anything false or that they are under any delusions. Similarly, when a trans woman says, "I'm a woman," and a conservative responds, "You're delusional because in fact you do not have female biological sex characteristics," the conservative is just equivocating. When the trans woman said that she's a woman, she was not saying that she's a woman in the biological sense. She was saying that she's a woman in the social sense. And so pointing out that she's not a woman in the biological sense does not establish that she's said anything false or that she's under any delusion. So, to be clear, when a conservative says trans women are delusional because they believe that they are women, but in fact they are not women, the problem with this argument is that when they say, "but in fact they are not women," they are referring to their biology, but that's not the sense in which trans women claim to be women. And so that doesn't actually contradict their claim, and therefore doesn't prove that they have any false beliefs. Now, here's another point. Nobody sensible thinks that it's an infraction of Jordan Peterson's human rights to impose on him a social, ethical, and even sometimes legal requirement that he call adoptive parents parents. We already have such requirements that are well accepted by everyone. If you refuse to call adoptive parents parents, you're ostracized, you're considered to be immoral, and you're considered to be an asshole. Nobody takes this to be Orwellian or egregious in any way. Additionally, nobody sensible thinks that if you refer to an adoptive parent as a non-parent, then you don't owe it to that parent as a matter of basic courtesy to retract, correct, and apologize. So why is it suddenly being claimed that we live in Mao's China when the left says that we should have the same standards surrounding calling trans women women? Nobody sensible thinks that the existence of adoptive parents undermines our understanding of what it is to be a parent. On the contrary, it extends it. Nobody sensible thinks that recognizing adoptive parents as parents erases the identity of biological parents. If J.K. Rowling came out and tweeted about how horrible it is for biological parents that we recognize adoptive parents within the concept of parent, we'd all rightfully be saying, "What the fuck is wrong with this person?" So why don't we all react that way when she says the same thing about the recognition of trans women invalidating the experience of cis women? To quote the trans philosopher Sophie Grace Chappell, whose analogy I have stolen for the sake of this video, quote, "In our society, the role of adoptive parent is almost completely uncontested. If you're an adoptive parent, you're a parent, for most purposes, and no one sensible scratches their head over that, or decrees that you can't sit on school parents' councils, or sees it as somehow dangerous or threatening or undermining of real parents, or dishonest or deceptive or delusional, or a symptom of mental illness, or a piece of embarrassing and pathetic public make-believe. On the contrary, people just accept you as a parent and value your commitment to parenthood as an important contribution to the well being of our society that you could not have made if you didn't have the psychological setup that you do. Unquote. So, given all of this, it is unclear what the problem is supposed to be with taking the exact same approach towards trans people that we currently take towards, say, adoptive parents. Okay, so I've appealed to the analogy of parenting to describe how the left views the concept of woman as having both a biological understanding and a social understanding, which often coincide but sometimes come apart, in the same way that we understand the concept of parent. I've used this analogy to suggest that the left's understanding of the concept of woman is not at all confusing or incoherent. But the discussion so far has been sort of vague. It could still be asked more concretely what it means to say woman in the social sense, and when does one qualify as a woman in this sense. Think about it this way. In the society that we live in, depending on what sex characteristics you have when you're born, you're expected to fulfill different roles and engage in different social expressions. Men and women are typically expected to act out different personality traits, engage in different domestic behaviors, have different physical appearances and fashion senses, have different occupations and interests, etc. As Riley Grace Rochong summarizes, the academic literature typically defines gender, 1, objectively, meaning it's comprised of A, the totality of one's social expressions, B, the average reasonable person's interpretation of those expressions, and C, the average reasonable person's categorization of one based on those interpretations, and 2, subjectively, meaning it's comprised of the totality of one's involuntary thought processes, which lead one to make those expressions. So, to reiterate, there are some social expressions that are commonly tied to the concept of woman, and there are some social expressions that are commonly tied to the concept of man. One's gender is determined by the totality of their social expressions, as well as their psychological inclinations towards certain social expressions. So, the term woman on this view can be thought of as an example of a family resemblance concept. A family resemblance concept is a concept which, rather than being connected by one essential common feature, is connected by a series of overlapping similarities where no one feature is common to all things. There's no single trait or specific combination of traits which we can point to as single-handedly determining when somebody is or isn't a woman. Rather, we have a collection of traits that we associate with the concept of womanhood, and someone is a woman just when they meet some threshold of those traits. And remember, the traits in question here relate to one's social expressions and their psychological inclinations towards certain social expressions. It's also worth noting that this conception of the concept of woman need not be exclusive against trans people who might not have the ability to express themselves in feminine ways. Remember, one's psychological inclinations are part of the story in terms of how we're understanding the term woman. So, having psychological dispositions such that you desire to be treated as a woman, or that you desire to appear as a woman, or that you desire to express yourself as a woman, etc., these are all things that count towards being a woman. And there's no reason why we can't, in setting the threshold for what criteria has to be met in order for someone to qualify as a woman, ensure that having such psychological dispositions alone are sufficient to meet that threshold, such that you don't actually have to, wear dresses or have long hair in order to be a woman. Just having those desires, those psychological inclinations are enough to be considered a woman. So we're not excluding people who maybe have to be in the closet because they live in a transphobic family or something like that. Okay, so this brings us to another important point. Conservatives often try to score gotchas on lefties by asking things like, if I said I'm a woman right now, would that make me a woman? Similarly, some misguided leftists, when asked what makes someone a woman, have responded, the fact that they say they're a woman. I think such mistakes rely on a conflation between the ontology and epistemology of gender. Leftists can and should claim that whether somebody is a woman, in fact, doesn't just depend on whether or not they say they're a woman. I would like to say that when a conservative says, "I'm a woman now," mid-debate to mock trans activists, they don't thereby become a woman. I would similarly like to say that if a trans woman, say trips and hits her head and subsequently wakes up with amnesia, only being able to remember a time before she realized she was a woman, and thereby she starts using the label man to identify herself, despite possessing all of the same desires and inclinations that led her to realize she was a woman before the fall. If we imagine a scenario like that, I would like to say that this person is still a woman, even though she's identifying herself as a man. But the fact that self-identification doesn't constitute what it means to be a woman does not mean that self-identification shouldn't be used as an epistemic heuristic when, on a pragmatic level, we are trying to determine whether or not someone is a woman. Let's think of an analogy. I don't think that someone saying blue is my favorite color is all it means for blue to actually be someone's favorite color. If somebody said blue is my favorite color, but in fact they feel more positively about the color green than they do about the color blue, I'd take it that it's actually not true when they say blue is my favorite color. The fact that someone's favorite color is blue is established by objective facts about their psychology, but we do not have access to other people's psychology. So when someone tells me that their favorite color is blue, I thereby take myself to be warranted in believing that their favorite color is blue. Similarly, even though someone's claiming that they're a woman is not what it means for them to be a woman, someone claiming that they're a woman gives us warrant to believe that they're a woman. Of course, absent extenuating circumstances, such as the person in question being a conservative who just said, "I'm a woman now," mid-debate, obviously to score a gotcha, right? So this is obviously a defeasible criteria, an epistemic criteria. So, okay, I've spent quite a bit of time explaining how the left understands the concept of woman. But a further question could be asked. Is this the right way of understanding the concept of woman? When somebody asks what the right understanding of a concept is, we could consider this question in one of two ways. On the one hand, they could be asking for a conception which best fits our common public usage of the term. On the other hand, they could be asking for a conception that best fits how we should be using the term, how we ought to be using the term. So let's consider both of these questions. Firstly, is the conception of woman that I've sketched out, wherein there's a biological understanding of the term as well as a social understanding, which sometimes come apart, is that the right way to understand the concept of woman from the standpoint of the common usage of the term? Well, there's an obvious problem with this question, which is that there is widespread disagreement on this front. Most of us would acknowledge that in terms of common usage, the term woman has a biological understanding, and most of us would acknowledge that there are certain social elements which are associated with the concept of a woman. But these facts underdetermine whether the social elements of the concept of woman form an independent understanding of the term, such that someone can be a woman without having the relevant biological characteristics, or whether the social aspects are merely correlated with being a woman while not being sufficient by themselves to actually make somebody a woman. Furthermore, when you ask people directly whether or not they think there is an independent social understanding of the concept of woman, such that somebody can be a woman without the relevant biological characteristics, the answers will be split down ideological lines. About half of the population who are more socially conservative who have more socially conservative values will answer in the negative, say that no, there isn't this independent social understanding of the term woman. And the other half of society, who are more socially liberal, will generally answer in the affirmative. So in terms of fittingness with public usage, it seems like really neither side of the what is a woman debate really has an advantage. Now that we've established the hopelessness of the first version of this question, we can address the latter version. The question of whether or not we should be using the term woman in a way which is inclusive of trans people is a normative question, and as such will depend on your normative values. That said, I believe that there are strong arguments in favor of the trans-inclusive view, and not very strong arguments in the other direction. Let's keep in mind the question of whether we should use the term woman in the way that I described, or in the biological essentialist way that's used by conservatives, essentially boils down to the following question. Should we allow people who identify as women, but were not born with female biology, to be socially recognized as women? In other words, we have some large contingent of people who wish to be recognized as a part of the category woman, and the question is whether we, as a society, should allow them access into that category. So, what arguments could we make in defense of answering this question in the affirmative? In defense of saying, yes, we should be using the term woman in a trans-inclusive way. Well, let's begin by describing the situation of transgender people in society. Transgender people in our society are generally defined as persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that which is typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. As a result of the lack of correspondence between the social category that they identify with and the social category that they were assigned to, trans people experience an immense amount of psychological distress, even to the point of committing suicide in vastly disproportionate numbers. Given all of this, it seems as though one of the best things we can do for trans people is to recognize them as a member of the social category that they identify with and give them access to the necessary avenues which would allow them to truly feel as though they are a part of that category. Think about the following analogy. Assuming that you in the audience are cis and have some attachment to your gender, imagine if you woke up tomorrow in a body with the opposite sex, and people started referring to you as a member of the gender that you don't identify with. Obviously, this would cause you distress, and the best way for society to help you alleviate that stress would be to recognize you as the gender that you identify with, and to allow you access to the relevant social and medical avenues so that you could once again feel like you are of the gender that aligns with your internal identity. The fact that affirming trans people's gender identity is good for their mental health is not just intuitive, but it's actually backed up by empirical literature as well. Indeed, according to our best research on the subject, trans people who underwent their desired transition to the opposite gender had dramatically lower rates of past-year suicide attempts, past-year suicidal ideation, and past-month severe psychological distress compared to trans people who desired to transition but for some reason weren't able to. It seems then that to deny trans people the access into the category of woman which they desire is to cause them extreme harm, and seemingly for no reason. So, at the end of the day, the trans issue seems relatively clear to me. As Liam Bright nicely summarizes on Twitter, trans people are a tiny and completely harmless minority who are asking for extremely minimal social adjustments, which would massively improve their quality of life. High-minded opposition to this is just cruelty with thin airs.